Seems like it's been well attended this week so far, and we're grateful that you're with us. I want to profess very early on, and hopefully very solemnly, that I know about as much about the Canaanites as probably you do. As I've read about the Canaanites, I realize that there's a lot of subjectivity, especially in the world, as far as what the world may say or not say. But there are some specific things that I want to try to focus upon, because the most important thing that you need to know, and here you go, Trent, and here you go, Mike, you must know the principles of what we mean when we're talking about the historical study of the Canaanites. And so I'm going to try to focus upon that. If you've accessed the outline that I submitted, it's a little detailed, and I probably will deviate quite a bit from it. The material is broke down in the outline in Roman numerals, the first Roman numeral being the Canaanite origins biblically. I'll go into some of that. Roman numeral 2, the Canaanites' cultural evolution. And I, in quotations, put the Philistines in parentheses, which was a little bit of a distraction for me, because tomorrow Ronnie Scherfus will study the Philistines more specifically, or at least that's the hope. But as you continue to study through the Bible about the Canaanites, you'll learn quickly that we know probably little about actual Canaanite peoples as compared to the Philistines. The Philistines will again be the great nemesis of Israel, and more attention is biblically given to them. So like your examples of when you get to the book of Judges, and Samson is in love with the Philistine woman, and yet God will use him to destroy or help to begin a destruction of those Philistine people. It'll be King David who fights that Goliath, that giant Philistine. And so what you'll learn is as if you were here and heard Brother Trent yesterday speak to the Egyptians, the Canaanites, and the Philistines are all related. They come from Ham, the son of Noah. And so they are related, and they are very similar. They have a lot of things in common. Their deities or their gods are very common. Like, for example, Baal. Baal worship was not uncommon to the Egyptians, it wasn't uncommon to the Canaanites, and it certainly wasn't uncommon to the Philistines. So that, again, just a little bit of information there. But the third point on my outline has more to do with the idea of the remnant of the Canaanites, as we will see them throughout Scripture referred to all the way and as late as Amos chapter 1, verse 8, Ezra 9, verse 1. If you're a historian in your Bible, you recognize that the book of Ezra will fall into a category in history. Later in time, 500 years or so, 450 years or so before Christ. And so Ezra 9, verse 1, for example, Ezra will refer to the Canaanites and the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, which are actually the offspring of Lot. Interesting connections you may see as you study this lesson is that Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 18 and 19 is associated with the Canaanites, and the reminder of history's lesson of what happens to Sodom and Gomorrah. So we'll try to look at some of these passages specifically to emphasize really one thing. If you look up the Canaanites from like an English perspective, like the word Canaan, in the Oxford Dictionary of English, they will state that the Canaanites, or Canaan, a biblical name for an area of ancient Palestine west of the river Jordan. There's no doubt about this. Again, people, there's no doubt about whether the Hittites were actually real people. We know that. They were associated with the Canaanites. But again, the actual sources outside the Bible give credit to them as a 17th century people. That is, again, going back 200 plus years before Moses, if I've got my timeline right there. The word Canaan comes from a Latin or ecclesiastical Greek word, and that idea has to do with, let me see here in my notes, an ancient city referring to gods, sometimes referring to merchants, traffickers, which is a translation in the Bible from the original Hebrew word. And so the word Canaan itself seems to refer to a lowland people. And so again, these are the ideals. Once again, in a source outside the Bible, the ancient Canaanite fertility god is something well known that existed in the river basin Jordan, west of the river basin Jordan, in that area. And this was interesting to me as I read more about archaeological research done. And I'm going to get to some Bible principles and get all the boring stuff out of the way first. Archaeological research determining objective ancient Canaanite temples, ziggurats, or whatever they would have been called back then, going back to the 12th, 13th century BC, again, all in the right timeline as far as biblical destruction and warfare taking place during the periods of Joshua. All of these things are, again, objective details that you can read about. And in at least two different articles I read, two different ancient, archaic, destroyed, excavated Canaanite temple locations, one thing was similar and always found when they dug these places up, was the relationship that the Canaanites and their idols had with the Egyptian idolatry. And so idols excavated were the same idols and idolatry from like Egypt. Ramses II, one of the pharaohs that Trent mentioned yesterday, is a clear idol or reference point that Canaanites in the land of promise, where the Israelites were existing and dwelling, were worshiping the similar and same ideals or principles of idolatry that you will find in Egypt. That's not, again, something then that should be odd in that they are related, they are family. From the son of Noah named Ham. And so, objectively speaking, you see a common cultural influence of modern day idolatry that then look around us today, our world. We are influenced by idolatry. Colossians 3:5 says covetousness, which is idolatry, a different type of form of idolatry today that we probably suffer from more. But idolatry, as one Riley Gaines said in a podcast with Mike Rowe, just here the other day, that the transgender movement is a movement that she cares little about in one sense, but as a Christian, of course, I'm using Christian as a, as she associates herself with the idea of Christianity. But she said this: every historical movement, though, that has tried to alter or thwart God's creation, especially regarding male and female relations, or tries to change that role like gender, which is unalterable, you can't do it, will always fail. And so she said that on Mike Rowe's podcast. And I thought that was interesting because she speaks objectively about, again, creation. Well, what is idolatry? It is the perversion. It is the perversion of who God is and what God says to do. That's what idolatry is. It's elevating yourself above God. So in the timeline and development of the Canaanites, you'll see, for example, the reference to the descendants of Noah in Genesis 9, verse 18, Genesis 9, verse 22. Let's look at those passages. Let's get a little bit more biblical here and more specific, and try to isolate the principles so that we understand what's taking place. In Genesis chapter 9, verse 18, notice the passage here. Let's just read here. Genesis 9, verse 18, the sons of Noah that went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And Ham is the father of Canaan. Notice how Moses, and I like the way Bryan was expressing the way Moses and his conveyance of God's inspired message to the people during his day and age about the flood, of course, the ark. Notice here Moses' emphasis upon Ham, the father of Canaan. That stands out for a reason, because they're going to become the enemies of God's people. And there's a reason they're going to become the enemies of God's people in part. They are, in one sense, God's people, though. They came off the ark. They were of the 3 sons, the family of 8 that was saved from the flood. And what we learn here is that they're going to quickly turn their back on God. Do you remember the story of Cain? Going back to Genesis chapter 4, I mentioned this yesterday on the panel. But I want you to see the principles in the Bible that God's wanting us to focus upon. The lessons that should have been learned before the ark, before Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Genesis 4, verse 6. What did Cain do when he was rebuked by God? In Genesis 4, verse 16, he went out from the presence of the Lord. What will happen as a result of going away from the presence of the Lord? Well, he'll do biological things. He'll do things that God created that are natural, like have children. And so Cain will have a family beginning in verse 17 and following. He'll start having sexual relations just as God designed man and woman to do. But unfortunately, it doesn't take long until you get to Genesis 4, verse 19, a man that went away from the presence of the Lord, and you see 2 wives in the lineage of Cain's family, first and foremost, and we start to see the deterioration of principles. Again, departing from the living God is not a good thing. Drop down to verse 26, when Seth is born, and the Bible records in verse 25 and 26 of this passage that Adam and Eve come together again in a sexual relation for the purpose of bearing a child, and God blesses them with a son. His name is Seth, for God said, she hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew. Those passages stand out to remind us of what sin looks like. And then we start to see the evolution of sin, because it's upon Seth's genealogy men start to call upon the name of the Lord again. But notice again in chapter 6, before the flood, in Genesis chapter 6, verse 1 and following, notice this phrase, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them. Now again, we're talking about the Canaanites here, the development of what happens. But notice how the sons of God, that would be the sons of Seth's genealogy, according to context in chapter 5. You'll get into that genealogy verses and compared to the genealogy of Cain, who went away from the presence of the Lord. And so the daughters of men here would represent the material or the carnally minded individuals. And they start to choose and intermingle the relationships, the biological relationships with wives with those daughters of men. Well, let me ask you a question, again, keeping this practical for our young men. What is it today that is attractive to you, young men, when you're looking at a young lady? What is it today that draws your attention? And it's not hard to say that it would not be some of the cultural norms that we begin to accept that become attractive. Here's an example. I've seen the sarcophaguses and things of the Egyptian culture, of the mummified ruins and so forth, and the paintings and the way they dressed and the way they decorated themselves and had jewelry and makeup, and it's a little strange today. Here's my point. If someone came walking through those 2 doors, and we would hope a little modest, but they were covered up in all the jewelry and the decoration, and they had that dark eyeliner type look, like an Egyptian. You ever walk like an Egyptian? Anyway, you'd have to look back on that one. If they came in those doors dressed in that culture, what would your reaction be today? A little strange? Would it be attractive? This is when you get into the relevancy and the subjectivity of idolatry, of attractiveness, and what is, again, aesthetic. But back then, it must have been popular, and it must have been cool, and people liked the person who came walking in looking like an Egyptian. I don't know if that's the way it was or not, but again, some girl group back in the day, in the 80s, made that song popular, and we all remember walking like an Egyptian. My point is the girls today don't dress the same way, but they do dress like what? What's popular? What's culturally accepted? Whether it's moral or modest is a different issue. But those cultural norms begin to become attractive to us, and we don't even realize it. Well, so in Genesis chapter 6, it shouldn't be confusing when you look here and you see that the men of God, the sons of God, are seeing these culturally attractive ladies, that's biologically normal, and they start to intermingle, but then God says something in verse 5, Genesis 6, verse 5, because this is where we have to learn to look and walk and talk like God, and who cares what the Egyptians look like. Verse 5, God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. I would cross-reference 2 Corinthians 10:5 for your New Testament application, talking about Christ and how we're to have our imaginations captive. In captivity is the idea toward Christ. Now, why am I pointing out this development of thought in the Old Testament book of Genesis? Because it's going to get us to what happens or starts to happen again with the sons of Ham, the descendants of Noah, who were close to God, whose progenitor, Ham, was on that boat, and he was saved and considered righteous to enter in on that boat. And yet his family, his sons, create the Egyptians, the Canaanites, and the Philistines. And they start to act like a certain thing. I want to show you something else that I know in Scripture. So as they go on to the ark, they come off the ark. We get back to Genesis chapter 9. Genesis will emphasize the fact that God will renew his covenant with Noah and his sons. It's a creative covenant. It's a patriarchal covenant. It's a covenant. It's a law to guide them. I want you to notice Genesis chapter 9, verse 8 and following. God spake unto Noah. Notice again the fact that God spoke, and specifically when God speaks, we must pay attention. Verse 9, and I, behold, I establish my covenant with you and your seed after you, and with every living creature that is with you, of the fowl, of the cattle, and of the beast, and of the earth with you, from all that go out of the ark to every beast of the earth. And I will establish my covenant with you, neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of the flood, neither shall there be any more a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the token of my covenant, which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token of a covenant. Now notice it, a covenant between me and the earth. Now this covenant, this token hasn't ceased in the sense that God will never destroy the earth by a flood any longer. And so the rainbow becomes a token to remind us that God hasn't forgotten. Interesting what people have done with the rainbow today. That's a little bit of a sub-thought, and I think it's a distraction because God still hasn't forgotten. I'm wondering if people are starting to forget and associate things, and they certainly are, it seems. But notice again, the idea of God renewing his covenant with mankind. But then notice in verse 18, notice how God reestablishes the relationship of man with God and animals with man. God created the animals. And what's interesting from this context, it's clear that in Genesis 9, verse 18, they start to expand, the sons of Noah, and they start to do exactly what they're supposed to do. Going back to creation, one man for one woman, propagate the earth, have children. Remember the purpose of animals. Now, I'm going to make a subtle another point in the law of Moses, and you'll have to go look this up, but it's intriguing and interesting that God will give the Israelites who are told to destroy the Canaanites a law. And from Genesis chapter 9 to Genesis chapter 49 and 50, with the development of Israel, this nation, and the development during this time span of the Canaanites and the Egyptians, the sons of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, God is going to refine a nation of people called the Israelites, while these Canaanites, these other nations round about that are a huge distraction, but they're related, they're family, going back generations, but they're family. And the law Moses will receive in Exodus chapter 20 after God delivers the Israelites out of the Egyptian bondage, which was based upon a judgment upon their gods in Exodus 12, verse 12, as to what Trent was talking about yesterday. A part of what you're experiencing is God demonstrating his power over all the wickedness of the world and sin all over again, destroying Egypt by those 10 powerful plagues. In chapter 20, they receive a law, and in that law, there are laws that tell the Israelites how to conduct themselves. Now, here it is again, in a very sanctified biological way, a sexual way. And in that law, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, particular Deuteronomy, they're told how to have a relationship with a wife, one woman. That's proper. But then they're told about how not to have relationships with men and men, women and women. And if you're reading the Old Testament law of Moses as it's revealed, it becomes shocking to you if you're raised in the church in a sanctified environment, as we would hope you are, and yet you read about this thing called bestiality, homosexuality. And whenever I was young, back in the 70s, that's 1970s, I remember reading that, or my mama reading that to me, and me wondering, what is that? What is that even talking about? And I'm asking you to consider something. Why am I bringing that out? It's brought out because it was a problem in the day and age they lived in. It had to be defined because of the mind of man and his imagination only becoming evil continually and wickedly again. And God is showing his people, you do not behave that way because it's improper. It's destructive physically. Maybe you're thinking again, well, what are you talking about? Why are you talking about that? Well, I'd love to talk to you about that a little bit more. Let's look at Genesis chapter 10. And notice the context. Because here are the principles of why God not only will destroy the Egyptians through those powerful plagues, but why he must destroy the Canaanites as well. Look at Genesis 10, verse 15 and following. You have 11 different groups here described in the Canaanite lineage. All right, verse 15. And Canaan begot Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, or Het, and the Jebusite, and the Amorite. I know more about the Amorites than I do about some of these others. I can read a little bit about them. The Amorites seem to stand out as the more populous ones. But nonetheless, it doesn't matter to me. I'm more interested in what's going on, again, culturally, historically, and why God would destroy these people. And the Hivite, and the Archite, and the Sinite, and the Arvadite, and the Zamorite, and the Hamthite, and afterwards were the families of the Canaanites spread abroad. Now watch verse 19. God has a way of keying in on the key points, the principles. And the border of the Canaanites was from Sidon, as thou comest to Gerar, unto Gaza. And Gaza will become again a Philistine stronghold. And so that's why I intermingled the Philistines. And that's why it's proper that Brother Sherfus tomorrow will talk about the Philistines. But notice this next statement, as thou goest unto where? Now why does that stand out? And Admah and Zeboam, even unto Lasha. Again, another Philistine stronghold, if I understand that correctly, geographically. These are the sons of Ham after their families, after their tongues, in their countries, unto their nations. Notice how it references their tongues. Something else that took place here that we learn about, if you'll drop down to verse 25, there's this little subtle statement about the Tower of Babel in chapter 11. I believe the idea is called ellipsis in Bible history here. The way the book of Genesis is written, like Genesis chapter 1, gives you the creation of God directly, 6 days, 7 days God rested. Then it comes back in chapter 7, and it kind of like, the word is ellipsis, I believe. Correct me, you academics, if I need to be corrected. But nonetheless, it comes back in chapter 2, and it kind of reemphasizes and gives a little bit more divine commentary on what's going on. Well, here you have in chapter 10 of the book of Genesis a statement of genealogical fact, but then in chapter 11, it's going to tell you about that division in the earth where the men are all speaking the same language, and as a result of being able to speak the same language, in verse 6 of Genesis chapter 11, again, there was nothing in restraint from them. They were too well connected, and God says, let us, in verse 7, go down and confound their language. So if you go back to chapter 10, you'll see where that division takes place and God separates them. When you see these little subtle statements about their languages or their tongues, in Genesis 10, verse 25, it was in this passage, unto Eber were born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. So again, you see that reference to when God said, I've had enough of this. Now here's another interesting, the idea of being able to speak the same language and why it's good to have different languages. Because it keeps a space, but 15 minutes. Okay. It keeps a space between us. Now, you know space is good. You know we need space. Isn't it good that we don't get to see each other every day? It's good that you get to see your wife every day. Take care of her. Be thankful when you get to reunite with your brethren like this every now and then, but we need to go back to work is the point. God wants us out there being light. Locally autonomous churches of Christ are important. We're all speaking the same language if we're speaking the truth. But even if you're in a different country and you're speaking a foreign language, you're speaking God's language, His truth, and God loves that. He's okay with that. What God doesn't like is this thing called the internet, that now everything can be translated real quick and we can understand every language and dialect just like this. And what's interesting to some of the stats that Terrence was pointing out yesterday on that panel we were on was that what mankind starts to do again when he can speak the same language. And what has the World Wide Web done for us? It's a great tool. I mean, I've made a lot of money with automation, with the ability to kiosk, mini storage businesses and so forth. It's a time saver. I love it. One thing I don't do is do pornography. I didn't know those stats. I have no idea. Because guess what? God's blessed me with a beautiful wife that I love. And guess what? I don't have to worry about when I go home what my wife has been up to. Because God has blessed me according to His principles and precepts to not be an idolater, a fornicator, or any kind of a whoremonger. I'm content with that. And it works. Love that point. It works. God's ways work. And they produce peace and blessing and harmony in your homes and so forth. But nonetheless, what was I talking about? The Canaanites. You see this development in reference in Genesis 10, verse 19, surrounding the Canaanites, and Sodom and Gomorrah is brought out. Why is that? Because you're going to see something else. Let's look at Genesis chapter 15. In particular, look at Genesis 15, verse 13 and following. This is Abram's renewal of his covenant with God, the promise of the Christ. Abram, you will have a seed. That seed will become Isaac, and Isaac will be the progenitor of Jacob. Esau, Jacob, though, will be the one that will bring forth the tribes of Israel, that will create the nation of Israel, that will go in and destroy these Canaanites. But notice Genesis 15, verse 13. Unto Abraham he said, know of a surety, that your seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. You know what's happening here? Something that's a subtle point. It said in verse 14, God's giving these Canaanites 400 years to figure out that he's coming. He's coming. Know that because when you get to Joshua chapter 2, verse 10, you remember that harlot that God will sanctify and save and end up falling into the line of redemption that will bring about the Christ? She houses two spies. And in Joshua 2, verse 10, she says something in the land of Canaan that Joshua and the Israelites are fixed to invade. She says, we have heard. What'd you hear? We heard exactly what you and your people did unto the whom? Egyptians first, and we know that you're coming for us. Why are you coming for us? Because God's righteous. This is about the militancy of the church today that we need to be thinking about. We're not seeking shelter, isolation, insulation from the world. We're actually on the attack. That's the lesson of the Canaanites here. And I'm going to talk about that in my last 30 minutes. Genesis 15, notice verse 14. He says, and also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come with great substance, that's Egypt. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace. Thou shalt be buried in a good old age. But in the fourth generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. And it came to pass that when the sun went down. Notice the reference of God here to Abram. Your family is going to go and destroy these idolaters. These wicked, sinful people that practice all kinds of nasty behaviors. And my people who are called by my name must act right. And if you don't act right, I'm going to come get you too. And that will happen in time too. Now, I want to show you something. Look at Exodus 12, verse 12, as I was thinking about Trent's lesson, just to point out and emphasize the spiritual battle going on here. In Exodus 12, verse 12, with the Egyptians to show fulfillment of what God said to Abraham, he says in Exodus 12, verse 12, I will pass through the land of Egypt this night and will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the, what does it say? Gods of Egypt, I will execute judgment. Who is he? I am the Lord. I find that interesting that Pharaoh, when confronted by Moses, says, who is this Lord? I've never met him before. Well, Pharaoh, you're fixing to meet him. And guess who else is fixing to meet him? The Canaanites. Now, let's look at Genesis 18 and 19 real quick in the last few minutes. Because I want you to see this passage. People, again, today coddling sin and thinking sin's a friendly thing to hang on to. Well, bless your hearts, it's wrong, and you'll end in demise, and I wish you the best. But nonetheless, you need to not do these things. I want you to notice here in Genesis chapter 19 in particular, you have the condemnation stated where Abraham will try to intercede on behalf of Sodom because he knows his family there is there, Lot. And Lot will be spared. Lot's an interesting character. Remember one of my favorite lessons I learned in history in college was from an atheist named Dr. Schultz, who said that when you study history, look for causal effects. And I said, amen. But he's missed a lot. Anyway, I remember the causal effects. You remember Lot and his herdsmen and Abraham's herdsmen getting in a little tizzy over some water in the land and so forth? And do you remember the attitude and characteristic of Lot versus Abraham, or Abram? What was Abram's attitude towards his nephew Lot? Yeah, he humbled himself, didn't he? When we learned that throughout time, the greatest strength we have in a man like even Moses is a meek or humble man. And oh boy, does God test humble men. Because you can study that out in Moses' life. Was he tested through his humility? Stand fast here, you rebels, while I smite this rock. And God said, you better speak to it. But he was still a humble man. Now, Abram took the humble course, and Lot did what? He said, I'm going to go down there to Sodom and where those well-watered plains are, and that's where I'm going to pitch my tents with all my family. And that's what he did. Well, let me give you something to think about practically is worldly people, materially, carnally minded people are in tune with the world. They too will be pitching their tents in the directions of fertility and beautiful women and things of that nature. I've not been to Las Vegas except just to fly into the airport and get out of there as quick as possible, but I hear it's called Sin City, and what stays in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. But I do remember experiencing in Las Vegas's airport the wash-ins, as I looked at them, and the wash-outs. Those who were coming in all excited and happy off the planes, and they were dressed up. I even saw some Elvises. That was a neat, I heard about Elvises, you know, the guys that dress up. And as I was watching this scene unfold, I watched the wash-outs. And you know what I mean? And those that had been there too long, and they were hanging on to someone they probably married they shouldn't have overnight and didn't know what they'd gotten into, and they were going back to mama somewhere, and they were the washout. I saw some girls, I don't know if I'd call them ladies, but they looked rough. They looked like they'd been through a storm, and maybe they were going to seek redemption and get out of there. But I don't know. Nonetheless, in Genesis chapter 19, notice this context. These two angels, it appears, means of justice, go down into Sodom, and they go to Lot. And notice here in Genesis 19, verse 4, the men of the city of Sodom found out these two men were there, old and young, it says, and all the people from the quarter, every quarter. They called unto Lot in verse 5 and said unto him, where are the men which came into thee this night? These are Canaanites. Bring them out unto us that we may know them. Why don't you just keep accepting all this LGBTQ plus IT? Let's just start all over. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, X. That's where it's going. And they'll find an acronym for whatever sexual deviancy. And what did they do here in Genesis 19? These sick, wicked men. Lot went out, said unto them, shutting the door, I pray you, brethren, do not so wickedly. And here's something interesting about Lot. I have two daughters which have not known a man. Now, I've wondered about this all my life, and I'm still wondering about it. Is it because Lot said, this is biological, this is the way you should be doing it, let me just give you my daughters, as strange as it may be. But that was his answer to their wickedness, and that's what he said. Bring them out unto you, and do you to them as is good in your eyes. Really? Well, I wouldn't do that for my daughters. I'd shoot somebody quick. If you came to my house scratching on my door, I know the laws in Texas. For therefore came they under the shadow of my roof. I've got to protect them, and that's a cultural thing where they had to protect them. But I want you to notice that they were blind and wearied and being cursed by those angels. What are they still doing down in verses 11 and so forth? What are they doing? Boy, they're just scratching and crawling to get in. That's when you get your bazooka out and you blow them away. Kill them dead. Because God hates wickedness like this, and guess what's fixing to happen to them? He's fixing to rain down on them and destroy everything about them, because God is a God of righteousness. He's a God of purity, of holiness. And he destroyed them. And what did he tell the Israelites to go do when they would get that promised land and get out of Egypt? And God would prove to them, I can destroy Egypt. Guess what I'll do to the Canaanites in the land of promise that I'm going to give you? Look at Joshua 24, verse 11, if you want to see. God made good on his promise. He fulfilled and destroyed those Canaanites. And it was because of men like Joshua and Caleb, those faithful, valiant soldiers of God, who went in and said, we're going to stand with God, and we're going to destroy this wickedness. And so when I say to you, and I tell my boy and my girls, bring it on, because I know in whom I stand, and I know the choices I've made in my life in Joshua 24, verse 15 and following. And those Canaanites, I know they're your family. I know they come from the same line. They're blood. And God, on this case, said, kill them dead. Because I can't look at this nonsense. I've made you a holy people. You stand on it and don't retreat. And I suggest we take these principles and we go out and we destroy some more Canaanites. That's all I got, guys. Take the outline and get more technical with that, but I appreciate the attention. I hope the principles, again, here will help us all.